much for including me in this interesting and important panel. Now the chair has asked me to introduce the topic by providing an overview of the phenomenon and in particular changes in the revenue model of news organizations. So there's no doubt that there's been a huge dramatic change in how news publishing is funded and the effect that it's having on the production of news. So we studied the phenomenon in depth in 2019 when we wrote the Stigler Committee report on digital platform. So I think the discussion should be informed by 4 sets of facts. 2 of these facts have already been discussed by Derek in his wonderful presentation, and 2 I think are new, and they relate to what you, Frederick, were discussing in your introduction, sort of the conceptual difficulty to understand everything that's going on. So the first fact is the collapse in advertising revenues. Derek gave figures about Australia. The figures about the US are equally stunning. So the total advertising receipts for newspapers in the US went down from 50 billion in the mid-2000s to less than half the amount in the early 2010s. The figures are still declining. It's not obvious how to measure it, but they keep declining. This reduction in funding has been accompanied by a reduction in the supply of news. You can measure it in many ways. You can count the journalists. The most stunning part is at the local level. So since 2004, 1,800 newspapers have closed down in the US. Most of them are very local newspapers. And now half of US counties don't have a daily newspaper. So this means that in those counties, presumably limited information is produced about what's happening in those counties. And that brings me to the 2 other sets of facts that I think are crucial to understanding welfare here, because ultimately we're interested about welfare. And the third fact is voter information. So the reason why we care about all this is because we want informed voters. Informed voters keep government accountable. They are the life of our democracies, and we need them to know what's going on. We've done a large study in the past 2 years, sort of measuring voter information in the US, and the bottom line is that voters' information is very unequal. So if you look at the United States, you kind of have a society divided in 2. You have about 50-60% of voters who are on top of stuff. They are following what's going on on the national scene. They're able to identify the most important story of the last months, and they usually don't believe fake stories. And then you have about 40-50% of voters who are mostly unaware of the main story of the past months, and they don't necessarily believe fake news, but they're just they struggle to distinguish between fake stories and real stories. So I think when you talk about voter information, the main issue is not that it's overall low, but it's that it's very unequal. And then the 4th set of facts is pluralism. So in most countries, we've done a study of about 38 countries. There is a lot of concentration in news provision, meaning that when you look at eyeballs, when you look at attention share, you usually have 2 or 3 large organizations that control a large share of it, usually a majority of it. And this is particularly pronounced among low information voters. So ultimately, I think this is where the public interest lies. Public interest is something you mentioned, Frederick, in the beginning of your talk, and I think this is why we're here. And ultimately, public interest has to do with voters' information and plurality. This is what we need in order to have a good working democracy. I think what's interesting later on today is to try and disentangle the theoretical and empirical connection between the first two phenomena, the reduction in revenue, the reduction in supply, and the last two phenomenon, voter information and plurality. So I look forward to hearing what the panel is going to say about it. Thank you.